You think the Middle Ages were all about monks, dusty books, and crusades. Think again, because what you're about to hear has never been taught in school. We won't talk about chivalry. We'll talk about how monasteries practiced punishments with sadomasochistic undertones, how kings kept concubines solely to reenact scenes from hellish visions, how so-called cleansings of sinful flesh were performed in temples, with young novices as participants. Forget everything you thought you knew about medieval morality. Behind the locked doors of castles and monasteries, things happened that would make modern tabloids blush. But before we dive into the most shocking secrets, don't forget to hit subscribe and drop a comment below. Which of these practices will shock you the most? You'll definitely want to talk about it. Let's start with this. In the Middle Ages, sexuality and faith weren't separate. They were entangled. In an era when almost everyone considered themselves sinful by default, the body became an object of both temptation and humiliation. And that's why many of the strangest sexual rituals didn't happen in brothels, but inside monasteries. One such case is documented in the archives of Saint-Benoît Abbey. There, the abbot practiced what was called purification of youth. Young acolytes were stripped naked and whipped with cords laced with blessed salt. It was believed that pain and shame expelled lust. But according to those who experienced it, the ritual aroused the mentor far more than it cleansed the young. In France, there existed an order not officially recognized by the church, but secretly protected by nobles. Once a month, they held a night of flesh. Men and women, dressed in symbolic garments, sacks with openings over their genitals, confessed their sins through physical contact. The goal of the ritual? To restore the connection with God's flesh through the flesh of man. Some regions of Germany practiced what was known as nocturnal purification, where a maiden was allowed ritually to lie with a man before marriage, to surrender her body to the darkness. Even parents were involved. The mother escorted the girl to the bed. The father read prayers outside the door. This practice survived well into the 15th century before it was banned. Perhaps most disturbing was how power turned sex into a tool of control. In Renaissance Italy, under one duke's rule, there was a tradition called public flesh confession. Any servant accused of sin had to appear naked before the mistress of the house with a bell tied around their neck. For 3 days, their body was subjected to punishment by touch. Not painful, but humiliating. And this is just the beginning. It gets worse, stranger, dirtier, and far darker. The fall of the Roman Empire didn't erase its appetite for spectacle. It simply buried it. And in the Middle Ages, those buried desires began to claw their way back to the surface, cloaked in robes, hidden in stone chapels, and whispered through sacred rites that were anything but holy. Long before the church had fully clamped down on the body, Europe was a land of bleeding borders and hybrid belief systems. Pagan traditions hadn't disappeared. They had simply gone underground, and within those roots, many of the most bizarre sexual customs of the medieval era were born. One of the earliest and most persistent of these was the ritual of the blood bride. Originating in what is now southern France, the ceremony was a fusion of pagan fertility rites and early Christian mysticism. Young women, selected by village elders, were brought before a hidden altar during the first full moon of spring. There, robed men and women, often respected members of the community, would paint the girl's body with crushed herbs and blood drawn from a sacrificed lamb. But this wasn't symbolic. Once the rite began, she was expected to merge with nature, which in practice meant a controlled public deflowering as villagers stood in silent participation. The man chosen was not her betrothed, but someone believed to carry a seed of strength. Sometimes a noble, sometimes a stranger. The justification, the earth demanded surrender. From today's perspective, it sounds like horror, but for them, it was divine transaction. The girl's purity was offered not to a man, but to the harvest. In some regions of Eastern Europe, a different kind of religious intimacy emerged, rooted in ecstatic Christianity. Small sects began to appear, especially in isolated villages of the Carpathians, where prayer was intertwined with physical submission. Known as the breath seekers, these groups believed that true communion with God could only be achieved through extreme physical vulnerability. That meant full-body prostration, exposure, and ritualized caressing during sermons. Men and women stripped naked would lie in concentric circles around a preacher, He or she would then breathe God onto their bodies, literally exhaling prayers while touching their skin. Witness accounts from traveling monks describe trembling bodies, moaning voices, and joy that bordered on madness. The Vatican banned the practice in 1281, but fragments of it survived for over a century in remote valleys. And while peasants looked to the earth and sky, the elite turned their eyes inward to obsession. In the courts of Burgundy and Milan, a new fascination emerged: chastity chambers. Contrary to popular belief, chastity belts weren't widely used for women. But among the nobles, they became tools of erotic power, not to suppress desire, but to ignite it. The game was psychological. A nobleman would present his wife or mistress with a gilded iron belt, complete with key, but the belt would not stay on for weeks. It would be placed ceremonially, only to be unlocked during highly theatrical confession nights. Guests, often other lords and ladies, would gather for a feast. There would be wine, music, poetry. Then the host would signal that the confession was to begin. One by one, women would approach their husbands and whisper sins, real or imagined, until the key was placed in their hand. The unlocking itself became the climax of the night, sometimes private, often not. It was control masquerading as forgiveness, punishment hidden inside ceremony. But it wasn't only the powerful who engaged in elaborate games of desire. In the heart of Wales, records from Llanthony Priory tell of wandering penitents, men who claimed to be possessed by lust demons. These pilgrims wore nothing but ropes, chains, and carved wooden phalluses. They would arrive at a village in groups of 3, chant for hours in the square, then invite men and women to touch the idols in exchange for a cleansing. The belief? That releasing others from temptation would free them as well. Locals called them holy beasts. Priests called them heretics. The Inquisition called them something else entirely, and by 1350, most had been burned. Still, their stories linger. Because the truth is this: the Middle Ages weren't prudish. They were obsessed with purity, with sin, with the body. And in their efforts to control it, they created rituals more twisted than any modern taboo. And the worst is still ahead, when kings began using flesh as currency, when monks began keeping vessels of penance locked beneath stone altars, when sex became law and pain became salvation. By the 12th century, the knight was no longer just a warrior. He was a symbol, a walking contradiction dressed in polished armor. Outwardly, he embodied virtue, discipline, and courtly love. Inwardly, many knights lived by codes as twisted as the roads they traveled. The concept of courtly love wasn't just about poetry and roses. It was a system, an erotic framework designed to channel desire into ritual. And beneath the surface, it gave birth to practices that blurred the lines between worship, obsession, and domination. In southern France, members of the Order of the Passionate Lance, a secret chivalric cult, believed that purity could only be tested through unattainable temptation. Each knight was assigned a woman of high status, usually married, and tasked with seducing her over the course of a year. But consummation was forbidden. The real goal was to push both themselves and the women to the edge of surrender without crossing it. To aid them in this, they used coded songs, relics, and even relic-infused aphrodisiacs. Eyewitnesses described men falling to their knees, weeping openly during these encounters, trembling with restrained lust. Some died from self-imposed starvation or from wounds inflicted in ritual flagellation, believing physical suffering would cool the fire of the soul, but it rarely did. Elsewhere, the Templars, long mythologized and misunderstood, were accused of far darker rites. During the infamous trials of the early 14th century, multiple witnesses swore under oath that new initiates were made to kiss the base of the spine, the navel, and the mouth of a carved statue called Baphomet. Some claimed the mouth had a hinged tongue, which could be manipulated, lubricated, and used. Whether this was truth or torture-induced fantasy, we may never know. But the rumors themselves fed centuries of suspicion that beneath the holy armor of the knights lay a hunger so great it needed ceremony to contain it. And yet, the church itself wasn't innocent. In northern Italy, a short-lived but very real sect called the Flesh Saints emerged around 1210. Their belief that sexual climax was the moment the soul most closely touched God. Their method? Communion through coupling. They built chapels in caves and ruins, adorned with painted ceilings depicting naked angels. Inside, couples would engage in acts of ecstasy prayer, ritual sex, timed to the reading of psalms, choreographed to invoke divine union. The climax was not private, it was shared, even recorded in the margins of sacred texts kept by sect scribes. Eventually, the church sent inquisitors to destroy their altars, burn their manuscripts, and scatter the followers. But not before one of the monks, Father Eliano, escaped to Avignon and smuggled a scroll titled De Corpore Luxde, on the body as the light of God. In it, he describes rivers of faith erupting from loins and flesh as the chalice of the Holy Spirit. The Vatican declared the text heretical, but rumors claim fragments survive in locked vaults beneath the apostolic palace. Meanwhile, in the shadows of monasteries and cloisters, new rituals were born, this time not in defiance of the church, but within it. There were confessionals where penance involved physical submission. Nuns made to kneel bare before their confessors, believing exposure would lead to release from sin. There were practices where monks would lash each other naked, not as punishment, but to provoke clarity through pain. Some orders even had unwritten codes about night comfort, where older monks would visit younger ones in silence, sharing warmth to fight demonic temptation. These visits were scheduled, monitored, and justified as acts of mentorship. But it didn't end at human flesh. In German abbeys, hollow statues of saints were found, filled with wax figures and crude openings. Pilgrims were told that laying with the statue and confessing aloud would rid them of lust. In reality, the figures were often used for something else entirely. Archaeologists found residue consistent with human contact, along with fragments of hair and linen bearing stains. The mind reels. But the truth stands, the medieval age was not just a time of chastity. It was a theater of controlled desire, where vows became loopholes, where purity became performance, where power, the power of man over woman, priest over follower, king over court, was enforced not just with swords, but with ritualized sexuality. And we still haven't entered the royal chambers, the places where queens were traded for flesh, where concubines were chosen by dreams and omens, where children were born not of love, but of prophecy, blood, and fear. That's next. If you're still watching, tell us in the comments, what shocked you most so far? Royal power in the Middle Ages wasn't just political, it was sexual. To rule meant to possess, to dominate, to command not only armies but bodies. Behind the thick stone walls of castles, kings and queens built entire worlds of control and submission, cloaked in divine right and dynastic duty. But what actually happened behind the throne defied both law and morality. Let's start with King Charles II of Navarre. Nicknamed Charles the Bad, his court was infamous for its night rituals, which took place in a walled garden known as the Whispering Grove. Every new moon, the king would select a group of women, sometimes from noble family, sometimes abducted from lower ranks, drape them in veils and perfumed oils, and present them to guests under candlelight. Each woman represented a cardinal sin. The ritual was a performance, but also a test. Guests had to confess by choosing the woman who reflected their inner guilt. Their choice determined what would happen next. Often a reenactment of their sin with the woman, while the king observed behind a screen. This wasn't theater. It was power on display. A way for Charles to own the secrets of those around him. Servants who leaked information disappeared. So did some of the women, but this wasn't unique to Charles. Across Europe, monarchs blurred the line between rule and ritual. Queen Isabeau of Bavaria, wife of Charles VI of France, was surrounded by rumors throughout her reign. Though painted as a manipulator, the reality was far stranger. According to preserved letters and anonymous testimonies from her ladies-in-waiting, Isabeau maintained a private circle of mirrors, young men chosen to resemble gods or saints. They were trained not in warfare or diplomacy, but in reciting scripture while dancing, in perfume mixing in silence. She believed physical beauty was a divine echo, and during Lent she conducted mirror nights where each man would appear in a different room of the palace, lit by moonlight, covered in silver dust. She walked barefoot from chamber to chamber, saying nothing, touching their chests, marking them with oil. Her belief that by absorbing the perfection of their form, she would retain her youth and ward off madness. Was it sexual? That's debated. Was it ritualistic and unnerving? Undoubtedly. Then came Sigismund of Luxembourg, holy Roman emperor obsessed with prophetic bloodlines. He believed certain children were born of vision, destined to unite flesh and spirit in a new order. But instead of waiting for signs, he tried to manufacture them. Every year he would gather 12 virgins, all under the age of 14, each born under specific planetary alignments. He housed them in a separate wing of the palace, raised them on a diet of honey and herbs, and restricted their exposure to daylight. Priests visited weekly to cleanse them with whispered prayers and baths of consecrated milk. On the solstice, he would summon one girl, always blindfolded, and lie beside her under a canopy embroidered with astrological symbols. Witnesses claim he never spoke during these rites. The girl would be returned, and the process repeated annually. No children were ever born, but the wing was kept sealed, its inhabitants replaced, its history erased. Royalty used secrecy as a weapon, and nowhere was this more terrifying than in Hungary under King Matthias Corvinus. By all official records, he was a just ruler, a military tactician, a patron of the arts. But hidden beneath the royal library in Buda Castle, there existed a stone vault called the Room of Echoes. It had no windows, no doors from the outside, only a single entrance, guarded day and night. The floor was slanted to a central drain, and along the curved walls, iron hooks protruded at shoulder height. Documents recovered centuries later refer to nocturnal trials, where certain guests, those who defied the king or bore secrets he feared, were invited to confess in the flesh. They were led to the chamber, offered wine mixed with opium, and made to reenact accusations using their own bodies. Confession meant survival. Refusal meant disappearance. And still, the crown was not the only seat of power. Ecclesiastical courts, those run by bishops and abbots, often rivaled royal depravity. High-ranking clergy hosted soul feasts, elaborate gatherings where acolytes dressed as biblical characters and acted out parables twisted into erotic pageants. One manuscript describes a bishop portraying King Solomon and lying with 7 women dressed as the virtues of the church, each stripped bare as he whispered scripture into their mouths. His defense? It was a dramatization, an embodiment of divine wisdom. In Spain, a cardinal named Vicente de Luna kept a private text titled Corpus Cordis Caritatis, the body of the heart's love. Inside were handwritten accounts of his divine unions with orphans, many of whom he claimed were vessels chosen for revelation. When his texts were discovered posthumously, they were buried beneath the monastery floor. The church denied everything. The Middle Ages were a time when sex wasn't private. It was weaponized, justified, sanctified, and sometimes ritualized into something beyond recognition. Because when power is absolute, the body becomes currency. And in the shadows of throne rooms and cloisters, that currency bought silence. But some practices didn't stay in shadows. Some spilled into cities, into festivals, rituals, and public punishments that turned shame into entertainment. You think you've heard the worst? The darkest chapters still await. Medieval Europe was not only the land of majestic cathedrals and devout monks, it was also a breeding ground for forbidden erotic rituals, shadowy cults, and secret gatherings that defied both morality and religion. Beneath cloisters and chapels, behind the veils of incense and prayer, strange rites unfolded, where seduction mingled with mysticism in chilling ways. Imagine crypts lit only by flickering candlelight, heavy with the scent of incense and flesh, cloaked figures gathered in silence, each bearing a mark known only to the initiated. These weren't random hedonists, they were members of clandestine sects formed as a rebellious response to the church's suffocating grip. One such group, known from whispered chronicles as the Grey Brotherhood, practiced ritualistic self-castration, seeing it as a path to spiritual transcendence. By severing themselves from desire, they claimed to rise above the mortal plane. This was not symbolic. It was bloody, brutal, and utterly secret. Other societies performed sensual rites that fused touch with sanctity. A practice known as the oil of atonement involved the anointing of intimate areas with consecrated oils by priestesses. This was believed to cleanse sin not through confession but through climax, liberating the soul by purging the body's guilt. There are shadowy references to monastery-born cults that baptize not bodies but genitals, plunged into sacred oils as symbolic rebirth. These ceremonies were said to elevate participants into a state of divine ecstasy, though many bore scars, both literal and psychological, for life. In deep forests, the so-called Brotherhood of the Shadow held moonlit orgies under pagan banners. Participants were marked by scars, birthmarks, or mysterious tattoos, and admitted into circles where all taboos were shattered. Blood markings, sex-bound chains, and spoken runes bound them together. Pain was sacrifice, flesh was the altar. Such gatherings were not always consensual or safe. Injury was common, death not unheard of. But for those involved, the mingling of danger, desire, and forbidden ritual was the very point. Suffering was transcendence. Love spells and erotic potions also emerged from these cults, crafted from animal genitals, herbs, and human fluids, steeped in wine or blood. These brews were said to connect lovers psychically, erotically, spiritually. In their worldview, man and woman were living cosmos, unions of flesh mirroring divine alchemy. The forbidden became irresistible. Papal decrees and inquisitions tried to quash the spread of these groups. All those engaged in impure orgies are to be cast from the church, the decrees read. But persecution only deepened the allure. Legends spread of ruined castles and haunted woods where such rituals continued unchecked. And so, in the hidden corners of the Middle Ages, sex was more than pleasure. It was ritual, rebellion, and revelation. In sin they found salvation, and in darkness they claimed the light. Now we arrive at the darkest chapter. Here we shed the last veils and face the raw, brutal truth, where sexuality crossed into horror and desire was fused with destruction. Scattered chronicles from the 11th to 13th centuries speak of the blood vespers, gatherings where participants anointed each other not with oils, but with their own blood. Men sliced open veins on thighs or chests. Women drank directly from the wounds. This bloody union was seen as sacred, as a merging of souls through shared pain and fluid. Some ceremonies ended with participants lying together in mock graves overnight, symbolizing death of the flesh and rebirth of spirit. Many died of infection. Few spoke of it. The cult endured. Even more disturbing was the martyrdom of ecstasy, a perverse religious performance in isolated convents, where young nuns voluntarily offered parts of their flesh. Bits of fingers, nipples, even tongues were removed and preserved as sacred relics. These acts were secret, symbolic, and staggeringly painful, performed in pursuit of divine purification through loss. Elsewhere, sacred prostitution re-emerged in hidden temples and forest shrines. Priestesses, some former nuns, others orphans taken in by cults, offered their bodies in rituals meant to symbolize divine communion. Pilgrims believed that climax with the priestess conferred blessing from the old gods, perhaps even absolution. The most terrifying account comes from the writings of an 11th century German abbot who described a ritual known as the Dark Altar. Here, men and women lay naked upon stone slabs etched with ancient sigils. A robed figure inserted ritual objects, wooden phalluses, gourds, serpents, and stones into their bodies, symbolizing divine invasion. The participants screamed in pain and joy. This was not just sexual theater, it was holy mutilation. Other punishments reveal a society obsessed with sexual control. Those caught in forbidden acts were whipped in public. More extreme offenders, particularly queer individuals, were castrated and branded. Meanwhile, in underground markets, amulets made from the body parts of ritual participants were sold as charms of wealth or dominance. In the infamous monastery of Santa Inquisición, One story describes a nun smuggling a box into the abbess's quarters. Inside, an ear and a braid soaked in blood. This was the whispering love ritual. The ear was sewn behind the novice's own, believed to grant her the ability to hear divine ecstasy, madness, trauma, or salvation. No one knew for sure. This was not sexuality as we understand it. This was weaponized intimacy. Sex became a threshold between life and death, body and spirit, ecstasy and agony. Few dared write these truths. Fewer survived them. And those who did carried their silence to the grave. Now that we've emerged from the darkest chambers of the medieval erotic mind, we must ask, what remains of these secrets in our world today? Did they die with the cults? Or do their echoes still haunt our culture, our art, and our subconscious? First, let's speak frankly. Many of today's taboo kinks and underground fetishes, BDSM, ritual roleplay, bloodplay, don't arise from modern perversion, but from ancient scripts. Medieval rites weren't merely about sex, they were about control, submission, transcendence, and those same psychological blueprints live on in contemporary desires. Secondly, literature and art have preserved these shadows. Gothic novels of the 18th and 19th centuries, Dracula, Camilla, Salome, all borrow themes of sacred seduction and ritualistic ecstasy. Even modern horror films and performance art owe debts to medieval sexual mysticism. We crave that tension between purity and perversion, salvation and sin. Third, there's the psychological residue. Modern therapy increasingly explores ritualized sexuality, not as illness, but as symbolic behavior. Some practices even adopt forms of psychodramatic regression, where a person relives trauma in a controlled symbolic setting, mirroring ancient rituals of pain, shame, and release. Fourth, and perhaps most chilling, our laws and cultural norms around sexuality still echo medieval fears. Social shame, control of female sexuality, legal punishments for non-normative expression. All of these have roots in a worldview where sex was seen as dangerous unless contained by ritual or religion. Yet there is hope in reflection. The more we understand the past, the more we can release its grip. Not all desire is sinful. Not all ritual is sacred. The stories we've explored remind us that when power corrupts intimacy, or when mysticism justifies cruelty, we lose the human heart of sex. So, what do we take from this journey? That sexuality is not merely physical, it is historical, it is cultural, it is deeply spiritual and at times deeply dangerous. But it is ours to explore, reclaim, and transform. Thank you for walking this path. If these stories fascinated or horrified you, leave a comment, subscribe, and let me know what medieval darkness you want uncovered next. There's still so much hidden beneath the veil.